you've been featured in a few of our articles over the years, and I think Bobby and Audrey, two of my coworkers, were just out here in January, I think, for something that you guys had going on. So I've heard about this wonderful multi-ethnic, multilingual congregation going back several years now. And I know that this is one of Bobby Ross's favorite congregations to visit. And I assume it has nothing to do with your proximity to Wrigley Field or anything like that. It's amazing how, when the Rangers schedule, the Texas Rangers schedule allows them to be in Chicago, he finds a story miraculously to come up here and cover. So that's the way it's going to be. I don't really do the national news as much as Bobby does. I'm president and CEO of the Chronicle, but I've worked there since 2001 and really came from a daily newspaper background. So I really didn't think I wanted to do this job early on when I took it. I thought I wanted to be, I grew up in Georgia. I worked for daily newspapers in Georgia, most recently Savannah, but that was 2001 when I actually left to come to the Christian Chronicle. I thought I was going to go out and get the Chronicle to offer me a job and use it to leverage for a raise at my old newspaper more than anything else. And after I met Bailey McBride, who was then the editor of that newspaper, I realized 5 minutes later, I really want this job. I couldn't imagine working for a guy like Bailey McBride. And I really saw it back then as leaving the pure, real journalism and going into a subset of that that's called Christian journalism. Now, my thinking on that has completely changed in the 2 decades plus since I've been with the Chronicle. I think that God wants us to do everything to the best of our abilities. And real journalism is journalism the way that God intended it. And it's to be honest about what's happening in our fellowship, the good and the bad, but to find those silver linings, to be looking for God working in spite of all of the terrible things that go on in this world. And really, it's the secular version of these things, whether we're talking about Christian education, Christian media, Christian music. That's really what God intends, I think. And then the secular versions are really the deviation away from these things. And that's been a subtle little shift in my thinking. And at the same time, I was worried about getting into Christian newspapering and saying that if I want to go back to real journalism, that they won't take me back. They'll see me as damaged goods, right? I've compromised my objectivity because I'm taking a pro-Christian stance, and I no longer believe that. And now the reality, sadly, is I don't know that there's going to be a newspaper business that I would go back to. I've watched this business that I love, people that I respect deeply, lose their jobs in an ever-shrinking newspaper market. And what's replacing it is a lot of noise. So we do our best to try and cut through the noise and give you what's going on in our fellowship at the Christian Chronicle. So that's my brief little soapbox for that. I did want to start by reading this passage, and this is where we kind of get into some of the slides. I don't know, we're going to attempt to share them with you guys on the screen as well, so you'll be able to see some of the pictures. So I'll just kind of cue you in as to when to do. Yeah, there we are. And now if you can just do the slideshow thing from there, or I could actually talk about it this way, but anyway.
Oh,
there we go.
Hang on.
Okay, the very first one is just the logo, so it's not, yeah. Okay, so we can go past that one. You probably have seen the logo before. In fact, we have a new logo now because we redesigned the newspaper. For those of you that come to the church building on Sundays, I do have some extra copies of the newspaper here, and they have a Post-it note on them that has a QR code you can scan if you're not getting it at your home. We can sign folks up that way. Please pass these around, and hopefully you'll enjoy our new redesign. So that verse from Peter is what I kind of wanted to concentrate on there. It's I took out from 1 Peter chapter 4, chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, and then we go fast forward to 9 through 10 there. This is a passage that we hear, but do we really take it to heart? And this is what I've struggled with over the last couple of years. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame." Of course, a messianic prophecy that he's talking about there. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. I highlighted each of those. That's what we are. That's what the church is. A chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are a people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Do we feel like that all the time, though? Is that characteristic of the way that we feel? I don't know that it is. A lot of times, the folks that I've talked to, they're in small congregations, maybe a gathering like this, and they feel like they don't make much of a difference in the world. I'm sorry I don't have photos of it to share with you. One of the most interesting trips I ever took in the last 23 years or so with the Christian Chronicle, I've mostly covered international news. And I've been blessed to visit about 90 different countries and territories around the world. One of them are the islands of Vanuatu in the South Pacific. The only way I even had heard of them before is the second season of the show Survivor was filmed in Vanuatu. And we had some missionaries out there. I mean, the total population of these 680 or so islands is about the same, is less than the Oklahoma City metro, I think. So we'd sent a missionary out there named Erik Brandel, who was working with these folks. And we went around the island of one of the little islands, the main one where the capital was, Port Vila, and talked to some folks at the various churches, and then these little 10 and 12 member churches of Christ. And they speak kind of a pidgin English. It's really interesting. Paul's missionary journeys are referred to as the Big Fella Triplo Paul. And so it's things like that. I was supposed to give a devotional later, and he said, Erik, gonna come up here and make a small talk. That was how they said it. And I was like, oh, I could speak in this language. That sounds pretty easy. Anyway, but I wasn't getting anything out of these guys. And Erik was translating it into their spoken tongue. And I was asking them all the usual questions I ask about: how did you become a Christian? How many people worship with this congregation? What is it like to be a Christian on this island? They weren't saying anything. And Erik, the missionary, finally said, they're really confused. They're really confused why you came all the way over here from the United States to talk to them. Because there's 10 of them, and they're in a country that they know most people can't even find on a map. And they really don't understand why you want them to talk to you. And I was like, wow. But we don't feel that way, do we? We don't feel like these people were a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. But they really don't feel that way. So I was trying to think of a way, just put a pin in that idea, because I will come back to that as I conclude this talk. And again, I apologize for not having the pictures of the chickens and the markets there. And it's a very kind of almost primitive type situation that they live in these islands of the South Pacific. I'm going to talk about a completely different place now, because we're always looking for the silver linings. And I want to talk about a country now where there actually were a lot of churches of Christ, especially compared to the rest of Europe. And that is the country of Ukraine. And you go to the next slide, you'll see a map of Ukraine. And this is how it was before the wars started. And is that coming up there? There we go. You see a map of Ukraine there, and what ended up happening, we think of the war that started between Russia and Ukraine as really starting in 2022. Any Ukrainian will tell you that it actually started in 2014. That is when Russia annexed that thing down at the bottom of the screen there called Crimea. That was a peninsula. I actually had been there in 2011 at a conference there. And then also these pro-Russian separatists started taking territory in the east and just kind of declaring their own government there. You see the city of Donetsk in the east. It was very powerful. The churches of Christ there were a lot of them there in that city. And then down on the coast there, you see Mariupol. And there are also a lot of strong churches there. You may remember Mariupol was in the news a couple of years ago. It was absolutely shelled into oblivion by the Russians, who finally were able to seize control of the city. We had some church members that were stuck in a church building for 55 days. And I got to talk to them in Poland about what the experience was like. And they talked about yelling out while the shelling was going on. They would all crouch in the hallway, the safest part of that building, and shout out the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures, you know. And they would just keep, and they would pray. And one of them named Sasha would pray. And as the gunfire intensified, they would yell at him, pray louder, Sasha, pray louder. So it was unbelievable what these folks went through in that town of Mariupol. I'm going to take you back to a time before that, though. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see what Donetsk in the east looked like before this. It was a very European-style town. There it was with a lot of snow on the ground when I was there, I think in 2003. You can go on and see some of the other slides there. Can you do it from there? Okay. If you keep going, you'll see that it's a very Russian influenced place. A lot of the people in eastern Ukraine are Russian speakers, and they're ethnically Russian, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The next picture is from outside the capital, and it's some tanks that they had decorated with flowers and symbols of peace to say that the Cold War is behind us. You go on to the next slide, you can see a congregation called the Cup of Life Church. It was meeting in the eastern city of Donetsk. And you can notice, look how young all of the people are there. They had just caught fire with the gospel and were eager to be there praising God. And you can go to the next photo. They have Baskin Robbins, and they really love pear ice cream for some reason. Of all the flavors, they said, try pear, try this, it's pear. And I was like, why? I get chocolate, but they loved it. And I tried it, and they're right. It tasted like pear ice cream. So there you go. But so that's how things were back in the early 2000s when I first visited Ukraine. You can go on to the next slide. In eastern Ukraine, in what's called the Donbas region, which is where they do all the coal mining, and the place that really came under fire when the war erupted in 2022. I talked to a minister named Eugene Soldanovsky. This is him right there. Because I think in our fellowship, Churches of Christ, we may have had more church members in eastern Ukraine than in most of the rest of Europe put together at the time. The big congregations had just taken off there, you know? And why was that? Why the appeal? Eugene said that during the days of the Soviet Union, when people disagreed with the Soviet government, they were either shipped off to Siberia to work, or they were shipped to the coal mines of Donbas. And that meant that when the Iron Curtain fell, you had a bunch of free thinkers in Russia, in eastern Ukraine, who were open to the gospel, and they just soaked it up. It was new to them. They were excited about it. Eugene is a coal miner, just like so many of them are out there. And he became a preacher. And he said that he would get in one of those little mine elevators, little claustrophobic mine elevators, and ride down to where they would dig the coal. And it took an hour to get down there. I can't imagine how. I'd be, if I weren't claustrophobic before, I would be able to get out of that thing. And he said, so I just preached the gospel to him all the way down. He had a captive audience in that little coal cart in that little elevator for an hour. So he preached the gospel to them. And they'd just been planting churches and going great. So go on to the next slide there as well. I mentioned that I went to a religious conference on the Crimean Peninsula. This gentleman here is a songwriter and composer from Russia, from St. Petersburg. He actually wrote one of the songs that we sing in my congregation, the Memorial Road Church of Christ in Oklahoma City. That is Konstantin Jubilin, yes, as a matter of fact. You know him, I guess. So Konstantin would lead singing at these conventions. And you go to the next slide, you can see this is the crowd that was there at the retreat. And there were a lot of people there that had watched a TV show by a guy named Sasha Propachuk from Eastern Ukraine, the minister for the Petrovsky Church of Christ, one of the biggest churches of Christ in Europe. And they responded to his TV show, and he would baptize some of them. You can see a baptism in the Black Sea that he did in the very next slide there. In waters once patrolled by Soviet-era submarines, he's baptizing people in the name of Christ there. So that was 2011, and you can go to the next slide, and you can see what happened just a couple of years after that. The Crimea was annexed by Russia, and then the Donbass region was controlled by separatists. You can go on to the next slide there. This is, I did not take this photo. We were able to buy this from the person that did. This is one of the pro-Russian militiamen walking through the building of the Petrovsky Church of Christ, which they turned into a barracks. What's been really interesting is that while you had all these open-minded, free-thinking folks in Eastern Ukraine who embraced churches of Christ, and even the Ukrainian Orthodox Church invited in Church of Christ organizations like Eastern European Mission to provide Bibles for their curriculum. They saw these as partnerships. They didn't see this as competition. Meanwhile, Russia gravitates more to the Russian Orthodox Church and really almost kind of weaponizes this as a kind of Russian national identity. And so what these separatists would say is, get out of this building. Your church is not a legitimate church. If you want to go to a legitimate church, the Russian Orthodox Church is down the street. So they kicked out a lot of our brothers and sisters, including Sasha Propachuk, and sent them westward into the other parts of Ukraine. What was interesting, though, is one minister in particular went from Donetsk to a place called Poltava, which I had on the map there, I think. And the church there, lo and behold, had a fight and had split. Who would have ever thought a Church of Christ could split over a doctrinal matter, right? But it happened in Ukraine. This minister got there and said, where are all the people? And they said, well, we've had this fight with these other guys. Well, what is your fight about? And they told him, and he was like, well, that's really dumb. Let's go find them. And so he got the sides back together because he was the neutral kind of third party mediator that had not been a part of this split. So he got them back together. And little stories like that started popping up in Western Ukraine where churches of Christ weren't that strong. Then comes the Russian invasion of 2022. And some of these guys that had been pushed westward are then pushed out of Ukraine entirely and start going into other parts of Western and Eastern Europe. So that was where we were in 2022 when we went to visit these guys and send them some supplies. You can go to the next slide there and you can see that we visited, and this is on the border of Romania and Ukraine, and they're still using some antique modes of transportation there out in the countryside. We actually drove through the land that is known as Transylvania, which was absolutely gorgeous, by the way. Did not see any vampires on our way to the Ukrainian border. And I've traveled a lot internationally, and I really don't like international border crossings. They always make me nervous when you've got these guys in police uniforms looking at your passport and controlling your destiny for the next few minutes. I don't know if you've ever been through that procedure or not, but it's a little nerve-wracking. And the customs guys can go through all your belongings. And I've had guys in Nigeria tell me that I can't have D-cell batteries are forbidden. They could be dangerous, you know. I've had all kinds of stuff confiscated. So when we pulled up to this border crossing, and all of a sudden I saw 7 guys in uniforms around our van, and we were taking in all kinds of relief supplies to Ukraine. And I said, oh my goodness, we're going to be here for hours. This is going to take forever. And Adi, our Romanian van driver, jumped out of the van, talked to him for a couple of minutes, jumped back in, and he said, they want to know if they can help carry our bags to the border for us. So you get to see the picture of them doing that in the next one. So I almost burst into tears because it was something else. Yeah, right there, right there. Yeah. So they were actually all volunteer firefighters, and medics, and they'd all set up shop on the border there, and they were helping these refugees that were coming across the border. So they took all of our bags up to the border for us and didn't look at them. So I'm so glad. So anyway, and I think Audrey actually got their picture too. I think she got them to pose for her in the next photo. So anyway, yeah. Usually guys with guns, I don't ask them to take pictures, but Audrey's a lot bolder with her camera than I am. So that's good. And then you can see in the next photo, we went on to a town called Ivano-Frankivsk. And as you go into town, you see all these support the military type road signs. It was really interesting. The folks that we went in there with, they're in the next slide. This is Dima Grischuk and his group of volunteer drivers. They're all from Churches of Christ. And what they've been doing is taking supplies out toward the front lines in the east to help out folks. And they ferry back women and children that want to get away from the fighting and maybe get to where it's relatively safer in the west, or if they want to cross into Romania or Poland or one of those places. They've been helping them do that. So we hung out with them a little bit. You can see in the next photo, this is Ivano-Frankivsk. They put sandbags around all of their statues. And that was the hotel we stayed in behind us. And they told us after 10 p.m. to turn our lights out because they didn't want us making a target for any Russian bombers that were in the area. So that was sobering, but we didn't have any problems while we were there. And at the same time, the restaurants were serving lattes and, I mean, it was surreal. Street musicians were out, so it was surreal. But then on the next photo, I think Audrey got a nice picture of a Ukrainian fighter jet that was just kind of patrolling while we were there. So we had an early curfew, so we had an early dinner with the drivers from Ukraine, and you'll see them in the next photo there. There's Dima, who's talking about that. And the very next photo is a guy that I was really impressed with. This is Artum Krylenko, and he is a Russian speaker who lived in Mariupol, and he's showing a picture of his bombed out apartment building. And he told me all of the stuff that he and his brother-in-law there, Artum is the one on the right. He and his brother-in-law went through this amazing ordeal before they were finally able to get out of Mariupol. And he told me the whole story. Well, one of the things that was funny to me is a quote that I've said several times since I interviewed Artum. The Russians and Vladimir Putin have tried to say that by fighting this war, we're liberating the Russian speakers. We're liberating the ethnic Russians from the oppression of the Ukrainians who don't like them, right? And Artum said, yes, they've liberated us. They liberated me from my apartment, from my job, from my car, and now they've liberated me from my family, because his family was in the Czech Republic. Interestingly enough, I ran into Artum a year later. I was on my way to Africa and stopped for a celebration of Pentecost, of all things. Did you know in Europe, Pentecost is like a holiday, and all the people in the Netherlands got it off. So we were at a church in The Hague that was having a Pentecost celebration. And they told me on the way, we're housing a couple of Ukrainians in our church building, by the way, some refugees. You'll get to meet them. The first one out the door, I'm like, Artum, what are you doing here? And he said he could bear it no longer hearing his wife cry on the phone. So he crossed the border. He actually had to go back into Russia. I think because he was of military age and would have gotten drafted by the Ukrainian army if he'd gone the other way. But went through Russia and ended up back in Europe. And now they have a thriving Ukrainian church that meets in this building in The Hague. So again, it's just been really interesting to see all this. One of the things Artum told me at the time, though, he said, I was a mechanic and I was working all the time, and I was part of the Lord's church, but I never really got a chance to do anything that was ministry related. And he said, and this has freed me up, liberated me to be able to serve in this capacity of taking these supplies, of ferrying people back. And so I'm thankful at least for that chance. So that's what I see over and over again. And that's why I have this next verse highlighted here from Genesis. This is Genesis chapter 50. You probably know this story. This is when Joseph is taken into captivity. You know, the life of Joseph is a life of ups and downs, right? Joseph is the favored of the 12 brothers. He receives a very nice coat from his father. His brothers hate him for it, and they end up selling him into slavery. but then he gets a really nice position in Potiphar's house. But then he's accused falsely by Potiphar's wife, and he ends up in prison. But then he ends up next in line after Pharaoh, when he's able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and he becomes one of the greatest people in all of Egypt. And then lo and behold, his brothers show up, and he's kind to them, although he does mess with them a little bit, right? I mean, he kind of lets them think they're in a lot of trouble. Finally reveals himself to them, and then the whole family ends up moving down to Egypt. So you all know this story probably from the Old Testament. Then when Israel finally passes away, the brothers are a little worried that maybe our brother was just being nice to us while dad's still around. But what's going to happen now? And so they go to him in Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 16. So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God, the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. So to paraphrase, they basically went to Joseph and said, "Dad totally said you had to forgive us after he dies." And there's the cynical part of me is like, did Israel even say this to his children, or are they just claiming? I like to think they're being truthful about this. But we see in the next verses there and on the next slide, Joseph's response. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So it's real interesting. I've looked at the life of Joseph, and one of the things that we don't really have a lot of time to get into tonight that really interests me about the life of Joseph and his brothers, and of course, these are the 12 tribes of Israel. They will become the 12 tribes. Now, Joseph's tribe, of course, is going to be broken into his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. But there are blessings that are given to each of the children by Israel before he passes away. And I think that's what I've got on the next slide, is the specific blessing that's given to Judah. And if you go back and read the story of the brother Judah from Genesis, he has a real up and down story in his life. He's obviously one of the conspirators that does not like his brother Joseph. He may be the one that suggests, somebody check me on this one, right? I'm sorry, I should probably look these up. I should look this stuff up before I say it, right? I think he may be the one that actually suggests selling him into slavery, or is that Reuben? Versus killing him, which is what at first they're going to do. They throw him down into a cistern, and then they say, and they think they're going to kill him, and then they see this caravan coming along and say, "Hey, let's just sell it. So at least he'll be alive then, and we'll get some money out of it." Okay, funny side story I have to tell you about VBS. I get distracted a lot, so apologies, but hopefully you'll indulge me in this. We had a VBS for the life of Joseph, and one of our ministers, Andy Lashley, who's a real comedian, I think, came up with this line. He was playing Joseph, and they had set up the big cistern right by our baptistry that they were going to throw Joseph into at the end of this scene. So Joseph walks in there, and he sees his brother. He sees his brothers there. The cistern's over here, and he says, "Brethren, cistern." Isn't that great? I love that. Anyway, brethren and cistern. Okay. So it was Reuben. Okay. Judah goes on to have a really disgusting story about Judah comes up later with Judah's daughter-in-law. And I don't know if I want to get into all the details of that or not. But that's kind of when he hits rock bottom, is when he basically ends up impregnating his own daughter-in-law, I think, right? Isn't that, and she sends him back his own staff, and he says, oh, wow, she's more righteous than I am. He's also the one who starts to step up a little more when they're going through all this stuff with Joseph. When Joseph is accusing them, Joseph wants to see his brother Benjamin, right? Because they're thinking, for all I know, they killed him too. So he tries to keep them in jail, until their brother Benjamin comes. Judah's constantly saying, my life for his. And I think Judah tells Israel, we've got to bring Benjamin back. The Pharaoh's, assistant, who we don't know is Joseph at this time, has said, we've got to bring him back. I will put my life and the life of my children on the line to protect Benjamin for you, Father. So he's starting to show a little more responsibility there. And then we get this blessing. And some of the blessings that Israel gives to his children, they're not the best blessings in the world. Some of them are just kind of like almost grim predictions. But this one, when he talks about Judah, he says, you are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. And of course, we recognize that today as a messianic prophecy, because we even refer to Jesus sometimes as Lion of Judah, right? And it is from this lineage that the Messiah will come. So this very, very flawed and damaged man who kind of turned it around toward the end of his life and started to do the right thing, this is the one that God chooses to eventually produce the Redeemer of all mankind. I just found that kind of interesting. And the reason that I brought that up in this lesson is I parallel it with another figure from the Old Testament. And there's a longer version of this that I won't go into, but it's the story of Hagar. And I think if you go through some of those slides, you can kind of see those verses about Hagar, who you might remember was the maidservant of Sarai. Yeah, Genesis 16. Hagar was the servant of Sarah, or Sarai at the time, I think. And God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they were going to have a child, right? Or Abraham was going to have descendants, even though he hadn't. He was getting really old. But then Sarah said, well, he must not mean through me. So she gives Abraham her maidservant Hagar, and they have a child together who's named Ishmael, right? However, that lo and behold, that situation causes some resentment in the family of Abraham, right? And so whenever somebody tells me that the Bible condones guys having multiple wives, I'm like, you see that sometimes in the Old Testament, but I can't think of a single instance, help me out. I can't think of a single instance where it goes well. It's always a horrible idea. Something always goes wrong. And it's more like, it's more like a cautionary tale than an approved example, right? But so we have this other child that's been fathered, and now there's tension between Hagar and Sarah runs Hagar off. And so she goes off into the wilderness, and then we have an angel of the Lord appears to her in Genesis 16. It says, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will become too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. I think the next one goes, yeah. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. And I think, there are several, you may have even done a study of the various names of God, Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah, I'm trying to think of some of the other examples. There's several that you can do. I think this may be the first of the names given to God in Scripture. I could be wrong about that, but you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Be'er Lahai Roy. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So it's kind of interesting that we have, I've paralleled the life of Judah with the life of Hagar, because they seem very different. And the predictions about Judah, which is very nice, the scepter won't depart from his house. Then Hagar receives this premonition, he will be a wild donkey of a man, which I don't think any of us would want to hear about a son that we had. That doesn't seem, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Yet she says, you are the God that sees me, and she rejoices at this news. I don't think it's because of this. I think it's because of the previous verses where it says, your son will live and will become a great nation. These two nations, in fact, that come from Judah and his brothers and Ishmael will actually be forever at war against each other, it seems like, especially when we look at the Middle East right now. A lot of people believe that Ishmael is the, progenitor or whatever. He's the ancestor of the modern day Arabs. And when you look, especially at what's going on in Israel now, in Gaza, these groups have just been fighting with each other for so long. So how do these blessings apply to them? And this is where I go on to the next pictures here, because this was 2018 when there was an influx of refugees from the Middle East to the shores of Greece in Europe. And a lot of them started going to Germany and Austria. This is Vienna, Austria. And this is a group of refugees from Nigeria and other parts of Africa, also Afghanistan, and a lot of Iranians. You can go on to the next slide, you'll see. This is an Iranian group in Athens, Greece, that I studied the Bible with while I was there. And they told me about all the ways that God had been active in their lives. Many of them, they believe in the power of dreams a lot, just like Joseph's dreams, which became, so prophetic. A lot of them have seen visions of the cross in dreams, and that's why they're coming to Christ. So these ladies are all having a Bible study there. But I think back, is there one more picture here or not? Or is that the last one? That may be the last one. Yeah, this is an Iranian couple, and they have a baby on the way. They don't know if they'll ever be able to go home again. They don't know if their parents will ever see their grandchild, but they were Christians and they were driven from their home, and now they're part of the Church of Christ in Vienna, Austria. Is there one more photo after that? Yeah, that's a big prayer circle we had there. I started working for the Christian Chronicle in 2001. And right before we went to press with the first issue I was there for, we went to press on a Friday. That Tuesday was 9/11. If you had told me on that day that in 2018, I would be worshiping with the Church of Christ that had to have a worship service in Farsi so that the Iranians could understand it, I would have said, there's no way that's going to happen. But look what God has done. In spite of all of the persecution that these people have endured, we see his mighty hand at work. And that's why I'm so appreciative of the work that you guys are doing, having the intercultural ministry that you have here. I'm reminded of the words of Dan Rodriguez, who's he's of Hispanic descent, but he was born in the States, professor at Pepperdine University, who basically said, multicultural churches are very difficult. They have a lot of problems that other churches don't have. It is a tough ministry, but do it. It is worth it. It is the future. It is the way that the country is changing. And this is what we can either lament the fact that things aren't like they used to be, or we can embrace what's at our doorstep now. So that's why I'm so appreciative of the work that you guys do. I'll finish up with that. I told you about Vanuatu, right? And how these folks felt like they didn't really matter to God. They didn't matter to why should they matter to the Christian Chronicle for one thing. And I got the feeling that maybe they felt like they weren't that important in the great scheme of things and God's total plan. What use could God have for these tiny little churches on these tiny little islands out in the middle of the South Pacific. Well, I was blessed with an object lesson as we were driving around the island. Because on the far side of the island, I looked and I saw what were clearly piles of dirt that had been set there for some reason. Piles of dirt, they'd been there for a while. They had little patches of grass growing in them, but they had the look that they had not occurred naturally. But it was hard for me from my eye line to see anything but piles of dirt right across from me. Well, they told me that what happened is if you were flying in an airplane, you would see, looking down, that those piles of dirt actually were in a pattern that formed the letters USA. And right across from those piles of dirt were the remnants of an old airstrip that was used by the United States during the campaign in the Pacific during World War II. It was an airstrip, a refueling station, as the Americans were hopping from island to island in World War II. So I said, well, that's my object lesson then. So when we got back and I had my, small talk, that was the name of the devotional. I said, from our perspective, we look at these things and we think that these are just piles of dirt, and maybe God can't use a small room of folks here to really do anything significant in greater Chicago, which has, more problems than we can shake a stick at or anything like that. And that's the perspective, that's our looking at the piles of dirt from the earthly perspective. But from God's perspective, those little seemingly meaningless piles of dirt mean so much more and have a great meaning and have a great use in his plan. So that was the message I kind of left those guys with in Vanuatu, and that's the message I leave you guys with as well. Is don't think that, if things aren't like they used to be, numbers are down post-COVID, and we just don't see how we're of use at this point. I think that's the point when God really can use you. And I know you're doing a wonderful work with the food ministry, which is why we're meeting here and not out there, because you've got boxes of supplies ready to go to folks that are coming out here on Saturday. So little things like that, it's planting those seeds. You don't always see how they're going to be watered and how they're going to grow. You may not be the one to do that. You may just be planting a seed that somebody else is going to come along and water one of these days. So that's the message I want to leave you with. And if anybody has any questions about the work of the Chronicle, got just a few minutes here before 8:30, but that's all I've got.
How much of your year are you on the road?
That's a good question. I used to do about 3 or 4 international trips a year. It's closer to 2 now, I would say. In COVID, it was 0, of course. I didn't know what to do with myself during COVID. I went outside and walked a lot. My procedure was I would scroll through social media until I read something that made me so angry that I wanted to respond to it. Instead of responding, I would go out and walk. So I lost a ton of weight during COVID. I was getting in 20,000 steps before lunch some days, stuff like that. But yeah, I wish that were still the case, but not exactly. Of course, I got some cheesecake tonight. That was what was the Eli's cheesecake tonight? So it's tough to do that, and I'm definitely getting some deep dish pizza before I get out of Chicago. So anyway, but yeah, and I'm married. My wife and I have been married almost 21 years, and we have 2 girls, ages 16 and 10. So thankfully, my wife's parents help us out a lot with watching the kids, because my wife is a pediatric endocrinologist, so kids with diabetes. Oddly enough, she does a lot of research and was here in Chicago about 2 weeks ago for a completely different conference than the one I'm here for this week. So
She would go with you.
we've done a few things together. We've done medical mission trips to Guatemala together and to Haiti back when Haiti was, I was about to say back when Haiti was safe, but there is no such time. When Haiti was safer, and we went to Cap Haitian to do medical mission work. She really likes going to Guatemala with a group called Health Talents International. They've been in Guatemala for a long time and have some surgical facilities and clinics there. So we do that. I'm trying to get her to go more stuff. And now my daughter wants to start going with me on some of these trips too. So I'm gonna try and start taking her. She's 16 now, so she's got her passport and she's all ready to go. Anyway, see how that
I'm
goes.
in the middle, on our island, I've got, I think it's the current issue, I'm open to Audrey's trip to Turkey.
Turkey, that's right.
And I don't know if
Yeah.
that's the most recent one, but anyway,
Mhm.
so somebody sponsored, or she did it in collaboration with some group, or how?
She went over. Well, I think yeah, we ended up paying for her to get over there, but we found out that One Kingdom, which was formerly called White's Ferry Road Relief, it's based out of the Duck Dynasty Church. If you're familiar with the Duck Dynasty
I
Church,
don't-
yeah,
I mean,
it's in Louisiana. It's where the Robertson family that was on that TV show that they all go there. And they changed the name a few years ago to One Kingdom, and they do mission work all over the world. And I didn't even realize they had done relief work in Turkey, but they were following up on it. They called us about it and said, "Hey, wouldn't this make a great story?" And we said yes. And Audrey had covered the initial earthquake. So we said, and she's so eager to go. That's why I'm not having to travel as much internationally, because and Audrey and I will fight each other for trips now. So I'm senior, so I still get final say. I've actually gotten her into several international trips. So it's funny because Bobby's the national guy, I'm the international guy, and we're both like parents for Audrey, I feel like. And it's like, she's taking more after me, Bobby. I'm sorry. She's international. She doesn't want to watch baseball, stuff like that. So it was such a coming of age moment for me when we hired Audrey. I've said this so many times, it makes her sick, I realize. But when I started working at the Christian Chronicle, Audrey was 2. That to me is just, I don't know what to do with that. So anyway.
Great.
And she was the one that said we needed to update our design because it looked like it was stuck in the early 2000s. And I was like, okay, I didn't know anyone could be stuck there. That still seems real recent to me. Yeah. So that's
She went to Hardy, you went to Oklahoma?
I actually went to Lipscomb for my undergrad. Yeah, I grew up in Georgia. I was born right outside of Washington D.C., but moved to Georgia when I was 5, and grew up in a city about an hour south of Atlanta, Macon, Georgia. Went to Lipscomb for my undergrad, and University of Georgia for my graduate schooling, and was working for daily newspapers covering cops and crime in Savannah, Georgia, when I found out about the job at the Christian Chronicle. So met my wife. My wife is from Southwest Oklahoma, little town called Altus. There's an Air Force base there. So if you fly a C-17, you've been to Altus, Oklahoma, because that's the only place they train on it. So anyway, the big cargo carrying planes, because they figure if you crash one of those in Altus, you're not going to hit much because they're just all open planes out there. So anyway, and we see them. They do the touch and goes at the base when we're down there, and they just look like they hang in the sky. They're massive. So anyway, but she's from Altus, and so that's where our in-laws live. So it's about 2.5 hours from Oklahoma City. They come up and help us out with the girls. So, which we're very appreciative of.
Great.
You see the Chronicle getting more involved in electronic news circulation.
Yeah.
So
We had a strategic plan that we put forward a few years ago to do exactly that, because we have a board of trustees. We're owned by Oklahoma Christian University at least through next June, and then we're going to be a separate nonprofit, basically. We already are in everything but name, but Oklahoma Christian really brought the Chronicle back from the brink in 1980. But we have our own endowment, our own staff, even though we're all considered OC employees, and our own bank account, and our own board of trustees. The board of trustees really wants us to, it's always like, get younger readers, get younger readers, get younger readers, which is what I also found out every newspaper, and that's what CNN also wants, and Fox News is all, everybody wants younger demographics. So we started talking about that, and the fact is, I don't think you get younger readers. I don't think they read, for one thing. Even online material, and a lot of what you see newspaper content when they put it online is called shovelware. You're just taking a print thing and you're just slapping it on the internet. You can add a few more pictures, try and make it look nice, but I don't think those are really getting read that much by younger folks. So we decided that we were going to have to move in a more of a video-based direction. So that's what we've done, is invested some money to do more video content. So sometimes I was taking videos earlier today at the food pantry at the same time that I was interviewing folks and taking still photos. And we're also, last year we launched a podcast to try and get in, although the podcast demographic is really interesting. It's not as young as I was thinking. I'm constantly getting folks in their 60s and 70s at church coming up to me and saying, "Hey, I just want you to know how much I love the podcast." And I was like, "Oh, wow."
We don't want you to.
I was like, "You were already reading the Chronicles to begin with." Okay,
We didn't
thanks.
want you to love the
Yeah,
podcast.
can you tell your kids? But the video initiative, we're hoping we'll get some more eyeballs. It's still kind of a work in progress. But believe it or not, the Christian Chronicle actually has a TikTok channel now. So I still don't know what to make of that. Now, I don't even know if the thing's gonna be legal in the next couple of months
We're
either.
Chinese.
Or probably, yeah, and that's all I say. If the Chinese wanna spy on us, spreading the gospel, then, by all means, they're more than welcome to. So that's kind of where we see ourselves going with this in the next few years. But I don't, because I just don't think, even with us redesigning the print product, we're not gonna get younger people in a newspaper habit for picking it up and reading it. But we want to keep producing this. A lot of people have asked us, the other side of that question is, are you gonna get rid of print entirely? And we say, no, we're gonna stick with this because that's still where a lot of our demographic is. We wanna, and I think there's still something nice about
Yes.
holding it and seeing the way that the articles complement each other and fit together, I think. It's something that you just can't do online.
And the puzzles are great.
Thank you. Thank you. That was, and I will tell Bobby you said that too.
Yes.
Because Bobby doesn't like the puzzles that much. And I told him, I said, when I became CEO, my number one priority is that we are going to get a crossword puzzle in this newspaper. That was my number one goal. And we did it, and then we added the word find. And now we have the little Bible bowling section too, which is questions that I get from these guys at the British Bible School who just scour the scriptures for this obscure stuff. And a lot of times I don't even know the answers to them. So. And we've tried bringing people onto the podcast and asking them the Bible bowling questions, like celebrity guests, like Will Hillman. We're going to get you on the podcast answering some of our Bible bowling questions.
I was on.
You've been on. That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. We need to
have to answer.
No, that's what we need. Well, just like a late night with what's his face, who just celebrated 10 years, Jimmy Fallon. Jimmy Fallon, like his whole show is just playing games with these guys. I don't think they actually interview him that much. So that's kind of my next thing, is to try and do some. I had Jonathan Storment from Harding. He's a Harding grad. He's in Little Rock area. And we had a blast playing Bible bowling. He missed a lot of the questions too. So I was giving him a hard time. They were hard though. They were really obscure. Yeah, kind of put you on the
You're
spot.
good at it, for sure.
Anyway,
Well, thank you, Eric. Really enjoyed.
thank you.
Your.
Thank you.
Thanks for the work you do.
Sorry I held you over a few minutes there, it looks like.
That's all right. See you, everybody. Have a nice week.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.